This morning's story is a familiar one, particularly the tail end of it. Even though Angela spoiled the whole thing.
Sorry.
It's a familiar one, and it's a story that's sprinkled with insight and wisdom of who Jesus is and what Jesus came to do. And it's one that I want to, instead of reading the whole story and then talking about it, I want to go piece by piece, step by step, and just kind of look at it a little bit deeper than we normally might. And so it picks up with the very first word saying immediately. It starts in verse 22, and so this story is immediately following what you heard last week. This comes immediately after Jesus is trying to get away and to be alone, and this crowd of people follows him to this desolate place. And in the midst of being there, it starts to get dark, and there's this realization that people are starting to get hungry. And so Jesus sends the disciples to go and to gather whatever food they can, and they collect 5 loaves of fish and 5 loaves of fish, 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. And the disciples realize, surely this is not enough to feed the thousands and thousands and thousands of people who have gathered here. So Jesus pops his knuckles and says, watch this, and before you know it, he blesses the food and breaks it, and they distribute it, and the disciples are able to feed each person until their bellies are full. And they walk around and they collect the leftovers, filling how many baskets? Okay, 3 of you were listening last week. Good job. Collecting 12 baskets of leftovers. And so the story picks up right after this. So immediately Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead to the other side while he dismissed the crowds. And after he dismissed the crowds, he went up the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. And so this story comes immediately after the feeding of the 5,000. If you remember, they don't count women and children, so maybe it's 10,000 or 20,000 people. Jesus forces his disciples to get in the boat and to start crossing ahead to the other side. And then Jesus is going to work to dismiss the crowds, to get them to disperse, to go back to where they came from. And then after they depart, Jesus goes up to the mountain by himself to pray. And there was a reason that he does this. Because at the beginning of this chapter of 14, right before the story of the feeding of the 5,000, Jesus learns that his beloved friend John the Baptist was executed as entertainment at one of King Herod's parties. And so Jesus learns of his friend's passing, and he is seeking a place to go and to be alone. He's in the midst of grief, and so he flees by himself, and that's when the crowd initially first starts to follow him. And just picture this for a second. Jesus in the midst of wanting to grieve, and here are thousands of people gathering, and he still takes the time and sees compassion in them and takes the time to heal them and feed them. And it's in this moment then that the crowd is dispersed, and the disciples are in the boat crossing to the other side, and Jesus is finally able to be alone. I've often used this story to kind of quip that Jesus was an introvert, and I still think that's true, and more so for my own selfish reasons. I'm an introvert, so I like to think Jesus was an introvert. But I think this story in this moment points to something bigger. That in the midst of his grief, in the midst of this moment, Jesus recognizes he needed to be alone. That Jesus needed the downtime. He needed to step away from the group, and he needed that moment to be alone and to pray. And if Jesus needed that, don't we as well? Because in the midst of great loss, Jesus recognizes that in order to keep moving, in order to keep making an impact in the communities that he's going to go to, he first has to take a break and pause. How often do we push through the pains of this world and just keep going? How often do we ignore when our bodies tell us it's time to slow down and take a break? How often do we forego vacation because it's just not the right time for our company, for us to disappear for a little bit? But if Jesus needs downtime, so do we. The next verse picks up and it says, by this time the boat, battered by the waves, was far from the land, for the wind was against them. Now there's something particularly scary about water for first century Israelites. A lot of scholars will tell you that in the ancient world, most people did not know how to swim. So the idea of a storm would be life-threatening if you were thrown overboard. But not only that, culturally speaking, water for first century Israelites held symbolically dark undertones. For ancient Israel, water, particularly violent water, symbolized destructive powers of a cosmic, political, and personal level. And we see the symbolism throughout the Old Testament, from the Psalms to the prophets. Rough waters as a symbol of that which is threatening and uncontrollable. Water was kind of like their cultural boogeyman. And so it's understandable for the disciples to be terrified in the midst of this storm. Think about another storm story in the Gospel of Matthew. It comes about 10 chapters, or about 6 chapters, 7 to 8 chapters earlier. And they're also on a boat in the midst of this storm, and the disciples are frantically running all over the boat, looking for Jesus, who is at the bottom of the boat asleep. And they're looking for Jesus because they want him to calm the storm. And this is a similar situation, except Jesus is not on the boat. He is still on the shore on the mountain alone in prayer. And the story continues. And it says that early in the morning, Jesus came walking toward them on the lake. But when the disciples saw him on the lake, they were terrified, saying, "It is a ghost." And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." The disciples, though, do not initially recognize Jesus in the midst of the chaos. And they've been alone with the threatening waves for hours. They're promptly tired from being up all night. In the midst of this crisis, when their energy reserves are spent, it's then that Jesus reveals himself to them. It's in this exhausted state, with the roar of the waves and the spray of the sea drenching their boat, that they mistake the Lord of creation for a phantom. And given the common perception of the sea as a locus of evil and chaos, it's hard to blame them for initially mistaking the figure of Jesus for a specter of death. In the next few verses says, Peter answered them, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." And Jesus said, "Come." And so Peter got out of the boat, started walking on water, and came towards Jesus. And the next verse says, "But when Peter noticed the strong wind, he became frightened, and beginning to sink, he cried out, 'Lord, save me.'" And it's in this moment that the story becomes the most real for us. Because Peter doesn't just flounder because he takes his eyes off Jesus. He flounders because he is afraid. But honestly, that fear is justified. It's a storm with raging powerful enough to sink the boat, let alone drown a single person. We know plenty about destructive storms, as we've encountered multiple hurricanes in our lifetime. And so Peter has perfectly good reason to be afraid in this moment. And so do we. Whether it's the return of an illness, the stability of a fragile relationship, the loneliness after loss, of not being accepted by those we esteem, whether we'll fare well in a new chapter in our lives, of what future our congregation has, and what direction our country will go. You name it, there's a lot of reasons for us to be afraid. And sometimes that fear is debilitating. It can sneak up on us and paralyze us and make it difficult for us to move forward. Fear is one of the primary things that rob the children of God of the abundant life God intends for them. But notice what the story says next. Jesus immediately reached out his hand and caught him, saying, "You of little faith, why do you doubt?" And it's easy to see those last few words as a rebuke of Peter. "You of little faith, why do you doubt?" But I see them as more of a lament. For in response to Peter's fear, Jesus doesn't simply urge him to courage or instruct Peter to keep his eyes on him. Rather, when Peter begins to sink, Jesus reaches out and grabs him, saving him from drowning and restoring him to his vocation as a disciple. And this is the case for us as well. Jesus will never let go. Jesus is with us and for us, and never gives up to us, and helps lift us up and restore us to a place in which we are called to go. And this is the promise at the heart of this story, and really the entire Gospel of Matthew. That God will never give up, and that God is for us and with us, and that in the end God will do what we cannot. And this promise is the one thing I know of that helps us cope with and transcend fear. And notice it's transcend fear, not to defeat it. because fear is and will always be a part of our lives. And we should take care that being fearful does not equate to faithlessness. Because courage, after all, isn't the absence of fear, but the ability to take our stand and do what needs to be done, even when we are afraid. And this story ends with these last two verses. When they got into the boat, the wind ceased. And those in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." This is indeed the good news, the gospel of the Lord. Thanks be to God.